Welcome to Le Petit Prince. I don't know if you have ever heard of this book, but if you haven't, and you read it for the first time, you're into a real treat. What you're listening to is Bach's Variations by Glenn Gould. Okay, so we are once again looking at the intercultural strand of in the languages framework for primary. And obviously, intercultural understanding will encompass things as literature, which is so important because the one way to get to another nation's soul is through its literature, through its art. Okay, so it's not just about French words, but why you would want to learn French in the first place. You need to have that motivation, and literature can give you that. In my personal case, when I first read The Little Prince, I was 10. I read it in Spanish and I loved it so much. And I remember thinking, I want to learn French just so that I can read the original. And that was how I learned a lot of my French. But it's just an example of when you expand horizons and you introduce children to different things, you don't always know where those things might take them, which is why it is good to provide them with lots of different resources. Okay, so at the beginning of the book, the writer has this to say. So if you've read that, it's quite telling. I mean, you can pause the video and think about what it says here. You can think about nowadays, there are people in that situation in France still, immigrants, or families and children alone. But Antoine de Saint-Exupéry didn't write this for a grown-up, because grown-ups, they've lost something. You may know a quote attributed to Le Guin that says, "The creative adult is the child who survived." So there's a lot we can say about creativity and the way we approach literature. So you see here that Antoine, he dedicates the book to the child from whom this grown-up grew. All grown-ups were once children, although few of them remember it. Do you remember? Here we have the author. Now, he was a pilot, obviously in real life. He used to take the post from France. One of his routes was from France to Argentina. And in one of those missions, his plane was lost and never again found. And curiously enough, the story of the Little Prince starts in the desert when a pilot crash lands right in the middle of the Sahara, in the middle of absolutely nowhere. So it's quite touching that the story links to the pilot's real life. So who was the Little Prince? Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about him. So here you have him, having met the pilot. Now the Little Prince, I'll tell you a little bit about his background. He lived on an asteroid, the asteroid B612, Le Planète du Petit Prince. Okay, and he lived here. You can see on his planet, he has volcanoes, and one of them he used to use for his breakfast. And he also had a rose, a beautiful rose that tormented him with her beauty. But he's feeling lonely, so he goes to Earth. And on Earth, he encounters the pilot. And he makes friends with the pilot. And he tells the pilot all the things that happened to him on his way to Earth from his planet. And he tells him a little bit. He says, "Je suis le petit prince." Now, at this stage is where you can take elements from the book to do with children. When I used this book, I used it throughout the whole year in year 6, because it's a book about change. about how we cope with loss and bereavement. Okay, and there is a great deal of loss when children move from year 6 to secondary. So throughout the whole year, we would read a chapter once a week or so. And at the very end, one child would get a toy fox that I had. So it's about engaging with the content, with the meaning of the book, not just picking up some French words and learning them by heart. That can keep you engaged for a little bit, but it's not going to touch your soul. So you really need to know what the book is about. Now, the big thing about The Little Prince is that he needed a friend. So it says there, j'ai besoin d'un ami, which means I need a friend. Can you say that? J'ai besoin d'un ami. That means you need a friend, okay? And the little prince did meet a friend. So here we have the little prince on his planet. And one of the most significant aspects, as we said, in his planet was the love he felt for his rose. Okay, and there we have him looking at the rose and also looking at the sunset. He used to get lonely sometimes and he would see the sunset because his planet was so small. How many times a day do you think he could see the sunset? And what was a day? How long was a day in the Little Prince's world? I think it was just about 40 minutes. So he could see lots of sunsets during the day. Now, when he left, there were two characters, the rose and the fox, that became particularly important. But he had lots of other encounters along the way. Le roi, l'écho, le géographe, le serpent, le businessman, l'allumeur des réverbères, le vaniteux, and of course, le pilote. So can you guess what each word means? Now, every character would add a bit of understanding for the little prince. For instance, one day he walked into a garden full of roses, and he felt terrible because he thought that his rose was unique in the world. That's what the rose had told him. And yet here he was in a garden with hundreds of roses. But it wasn't until he met his friend, the fox, that he realized what the real secret of uniqueness is. Because the fox gave him a present, and the understanding is that only the heart can see clearly. What's really important is invisible to the eyes. It is the time he spent on his rose that made his rose unique, not the fact that it was the only one in the world. So all those things we get to understand through the book, what it means to make friendships, what it means to leave them, and yet to retain them in our heart. So it's such a beautiful message. Okay, so here we have the little prince talking to the pilot. The first thing he asked the pilot was to draw him a sheep. And then, of course, the little prince realized what happens when he takes a sheep back to his planet. Okay, so the little prince wants to know why roses have thorns. Okay, because he thought roses had thorns to protect themselves. But if a sheep comes along and eats a thorn all the same, what's the point of the thorns? Les épines, à quoi servent-elles? What are the thorns for? Okay, what kind of protection do they give? And of course, the little prince, when he leaves the planet, you can see the picture below there. You see the pilot, the little prince, and the well. And as they pull, because they found water in the desert, as they pull the pulley, because it's rusted, it makes a beautiful sound that sounds like bells when you look up at the sky. Each star is like the twinkling, like a well, and it will remind the little prince of the pilot, his friend. And the pilot, every time he looks at the fields of wheat rather, he will be reminded of the little prince's hair, Okay, so everything reminds us of somebody else. Okay, now I'm going to let you listen to the Little Prince. It doesn't matter that you don't understand everything he says. I more or less told you what his problem was. He was angry because the pilot was not taking him seriously. The pilot was behaving like the businessman. So he's going to be telling the pilot off in a minute. He's a bit upset, but I just want you to bask in the sound of the Little Prince talking in French.
Il y a des millions d'années que les fleurs fabriquent des épines. Il y a des millions d'années que les moutons mangent quand même les fleurs. Et ce n'est pas sérieux de chercher à comprendre pourquoi elles se donnent tant de mal pour se fabriquer des épines qui ne servent jamais à rien. Ce n'est pas important la guerre des moutons et des fleurs. Ce n'est pas plus sérieux et plus important que les additions d'un gros monsieur rouge. Et si je connais, moi, une fleur unique au monde, qui n'existe nulle part sauf dans ma planète, et qu'un petit mouton peut anéantir d'un seul coup comme ça un matin, sans se rendre compte de ce qu'il fait. Ce n'est pas important, ça. Si quelqu'un aime une fleur qui n'existe qu'un exemplaire dans des millions et des millions d'étoiles, ça suffit pour qu'il soit heureux quand il la regarde. Il se dit, ma fleur est là quelque part. Mais si le mouton mange la fleur, c'est pour lui comme si, brusquement, toutes les étoiles s'éteignaient. Ce n'est pas important, ça.
Well, I'm going to leave you here on this bench so you can think about the Little Prince and maybe meet him one day. He might come to you just like that, as he tended to do. Now, there are lots of funny things in the story that happen. It's really entertaining, all the characters he meets, so it's not a sad story at all. But at the core, as I said, sits this question of what is friendship? What does it mean to lose something and yet retain it in our hearts? Okay, so I really hope that you engage with that book in your own time, in English, of course, unless you can speak French. So the activity you need to do now is to go to Moodle and the links to activities, and you will find this conversation with Michael and Ben, and they both talk about their engagement with the Little Prince. There's a new publication where Michael translated the Little Prince, so his own version. So it should be quite nice to hear. And so only 10 minutes, please, because it's quite long, but the first 10 minutes are quite nice. And then if you go online, if you go to Google Little Prince, you're going to be bombarded by images of the story. The author himself, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, he made these drawings. Okay, so they're quite quaint. Choose a scene, an encounter that the Little Prince had from those images, and take a snapshot of it and upload it onto the Padlet, adding a comment of why you chose it and what you might do with the children. So I really hope that you enjoy it. We see you back in the room.